You can argue with a king if you must, but never argue with the place his wolf has already decided is home. Emily Carter muttered those words under her breath as she stared across her backyard and wondered if she had finally lost her mind. The giant white wolf stretched lazily beneath the morning sun as though the flower beds, the stone path, and every inch of her carefully tended garden had belonged to him long before she had ever planted her first seed. The lavender swayed gently around his enormous frame, untouched despite his size, while butterflies drifted above him without the slightest hint of fear. Emily tightened her grip on the watering can. She had spent 5 years turning the neglected patch of land behind her little cottage into something beautiful. Every rose bush had been planted by hand. Every climbing vine had been trained along the weathered fence. Every tomato, herb, and wildflower reminded her that life could quietly bloom again after loss. Then, 3 weeks ago, the wolf had arrived without permission, without warning, and apparently without any intention of leaving. "Excuse me," she called firmly. "You're in my garden again." The wolf slowly lifted his head. Brilliant silver eyes met hers with calm confidence. He blinked once, almost politely, then lowered his massive head back onto his paws as if her opinion carried absolutely no authority. Emily let out a frustrated sigh. That wasn't a suggestion. Nothing. Not even the twitch of an ear. She marched across the yard until she stopped several feet away. Up close, he looked even larger than she remembered, easily the size of a small horse, his thick white coat glowing against the green grass. Yet something about him felt strangely peaceful instead of threatening. Birds continued singing overhead. Rabbits still wandered along the edge of the woods. Even her orange tabby cat, Maple, merely sat on the porch watching the silent standoff with complete indifference, as though accepting the enormous visitor had become part of the morning routine. Emily pointed toward the forest beyond her fence. "Your home is over there." The wolf slowly looked toward the trees. Then he looked back at her. Then, he deliberately rested one enormous paw on the edge of her vegetable bed. Emily stared in disbelief. "Oh, now you're doing that on purpose." She couldn't explain why it felt less like dealing with an animal and more like arguing with an impossibly stubborn neighbor. Every sunrise followed the same strange pattern. She would wake before 6, brew coffee, step outside, and discover him already waiting somewhere among the flowers as though he'd been conducting inspections all night. He never damaged the roses. He never crushed the herbs. Somehow, despite weighing hundreds of pounds, he avoided every delicate blossom she loved most. Instead, he simply occupied the center of her garden with quiet confidence that somehow made the entire place feel different. Older. Protected. The townspeople offered every explanation imaginable. Some insisted he belonged to a wealthy rancher farther north. Others claimed no ordinary wolf had eyes that silver. Mrs. Henderson from the general store crossed herself every time Emily mentioned him and whispered that certain creatures chose land instead of owners. Emily laughed off every rumor, but deep down, she couldn't ignore one impossible detail. Whenever the wolf appeared, the garden seemed healthier than the day before. Roses opened earlier. Herbs smelled sweeter. Even the struggling apple tree her father planted years ago had begun producing blossoms again after seasons of silence. That morning, as Emily knelt beside the first blooming peonies of spring, she noticed fresh footprints leading away from the garden gate. Human footprints. Large boots. They stopped exactly where the wolf had been lying only minutes earlier. Emily slowly stood, her heartbeat quickening as a cool breeze stirred the lavender. Somewhere beyond the trees, she caught the briefest glimpse of a tall man dressed in black disappearing between shafts of morning sunlight. And for reasons she couldn't explain, the empty space beside her flowers suddenly felt far more mysterious than the wolf who kept insisting her garden belonged to him. Emily decided that diplomacy had officially failed by Wednesday morning. She had tried speaking calmly, clapping her hands, leaving the garden gate wide open, and even placing a basket of fresh apples near the edge of the woods in the hope that the magnificent visitor would develop an interest somewhere other than her backyard. None of it worked. Every sunrise revealed the same impossible scene. The giant white wolf would already be there, resting beneath a different tree or beside another flower bed, as though he were conducting an inspection of property that required his daily approval. Yet the more carefully she watched him, the stranger everything became. He never trampled a single blossom. He never snapped a branch. Somehow his enormous paws always found the narrow stone paths she had built years earlier, even though she had never once seen him study the layout. One morning, she discovered that the rabbits had eaten half of her lettuce during the night, but every vegetable planted closest to the wolf remained untouched. The following day, a family of deer wandered toward the garden fence before suddenly stopping, quietly turning around, and disappearing back into the forest without disturbing a single plant. It was almost as if every creature understood invisible rules that only Emily had never been told. Maple certainly seemed to understand. Her orange cat had progressed from suspicious observer to shameless companion. Emily stepped onto the porch carrying her coffee and nearly dropped the mug when she found Maple curled comfortably against the wolf's thick white fur, purring as though she had known him forever. Seriously? Emily sighed. You were supposed to be on my side. Maple opened one sleepy eye, ignored her completely, and settled even closer against the enormous animal. The wolf looked at Emily with unmistakable satisfaction before calmly closing his own eyes again. She folded her arms. Do not look so pleased with yourself. For the first time since he had appeared, she thought she saw the corners of his mouth lift ever so slightly. It looked suspiciously like amusement. By late afternoon, Emily walked into town carrying a basket of fresh herbs for the weekly farmer's market. Every conversation somehow drifted back to her unusual visitor. Mr. Dawson at the hardware store laughed and suggested she charge the wolf rent. Mrs. Henderson simply frowned and reminded Emily that old forests remembered promises people had forgotten. Even Sheriff Collins admitted that nobody had reported a missing wolf matching that description. If he wanted trouble, the sheriff said thoughtfully, you would already know it. Sounds to me like he has chosen to stay for a reason. Chosen. The word lingered in Emily's thoughts all the way home. As the evening sun painted the hills gold, she noticed something new waiting beside her front gate. A section of the old fence that had collapsed during last winter's storm now stood perfectly upright. Fresh wooden posts had been set into the ground with remarkable craftsmanship, every board carefully aligned as though completed by someone who respected the garden as much as she did. Emily slowly looked around the empty property. No wagon tracks, no tools, no neighbors, only the scent of pine drifting on the evening breeze. Then she noticed fresh boot prints leading away from the repaired fence and disappearing toward the forest once again. Moments later, the white wolf emerged from between the trees, paused beside the new gate, glanced at the flawless repair, and then looked directly at Emily with quiet silver eyes that seemed to ask whether she finally understood that someone had been watching over the garden long before she realized she was not its only guardian. Emily barely slept that night. Every time the old farmhouse settled with its familiar creaks, she found herself glancing toward the window overlooking the garden. The repaired fence stood exactly where the broken boards had been less than 24 hours earlier, solid enough to survive another decade. Someone had done the work with extraordinary care, matching the grain of the original cedar so perfectly that even she struggled to tell where the old fence ended and the new one began. By sunrise, she carried a tray outside with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, although she immediately laughed at herself. Apparently, I am losing my mind, she whispered. 1 cup for me and 1 for a wolf. The white wolf was already waiting beneath the blooming apple tree. He watched her set the second mug on the stone table without moving an inch. It is coffee, Emily explained with exaggerated patience. Not a peace treaty. The wolf lowered his nose toward the mug, sniffed once, then looked back at her with unmistakable disapproval. Emily smiled despite herself. Too strong for you. The animal slowly turned his head away, as if refusing to acknowledge such an insulting suggestion. She could have sworn he looked offended. A quiet laugh escaped before she could stop it. The strange routine might have continued all morning if an unfamiliar voice had not interrupted the peaceful silence. He has always been difficult to impress. Emily spun around so quickly that a few drops of coffee splashed onto the table. A tall man stood just outside the open garden gate, dressed in a charcoal jacket over a simple black shirt, hiking boots dusted with the pale dirt of the forest trails. His dark hair shifted gently in the breeze, but it was his remarkable silver eyes that held her attention. They reflected the morning light with the same calm brightness she had seen countless times looking into the wolf's gaze. I am sorry, he said with an easy smile. I did not mean to startle you. Emily straightened immediately. You walked onto private property without making a sound. That is a little startling. Instead of appearing embarrassed, the stranger nodded politely. That is fair. His attention drifted toward the wolf, who remained comfortably stretched beneath the apple tree without showing the slightest surprise at the visitor's arrival. Your dog seems unusually relaxed around you, Emily observed carefully. He is not my dog, the man replied. He would probably object to being called one. Emily folded her arms. Then you know him. We have crossed paths. Convenient answer. A hint of amusement flickered across his face. You asked direct questions. I like direct answers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Birds fluttered between the flower beds while a gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender through the garden. The stranger slowly walked toward the repaired fence, running his fingertips across the smooth cedar boards. Beautiful. Craftsmanship, he said quietly. Whoever fixed this respected the place. Emily studied him closely. Funny you should mention that. I was hoping to thank whoever repaired it. He smiled without looking at her. Sometimes gratitude reaches the right person even without names. Before she could respond, Maple trotted happily across the yard, brushing against the man's leg before curling beside the white wolf as though greeting two old friends at once. Emily frowned. Her cat trusted almost nobody that quickly. The stranger noticed her expression but said nothing. Instead, he turned toward the forest. My name is Ethan, he said at last. Ethan Blackwood. Emily repeated the name silently. Sensing it carried a weight she could not explain. When she looked down for only a second to pick up the untouched mug of coffee, the white wolf had disappeared. When she looked back toward the gate, Ethan was already halfway to the trees, and for one impossible heartbeat, the morning sunlight caught his silver eyes with exactly the same quiet, knowing expression the mysterious wolf had worn every single day inside her garden. Emily told herself there had to be a perfectly reasonable explanation. Men did not simply appear from the forest moments after mysterious wolves vanished. Cats did not instantly trust complete strangers. Broken fences did not repair themselves overnight without the sound of a single hammer. Yet every explanation she reached for seemed to disappear the moment she looked into Ethan Blackwood's quiet silver eyes. The next few days settled into an even stranger rhythm. Ethan never arrived unexpectedly anymore. Instead, he appeared just often enough to feel familiar without becoming predictable. Sometimes she found him standing near the old apple tree, studying the blossoms with thoughtful silence. Other mornings he was already kneeling beside the vegetable beds, carefully removing weeds before she even stepped outside. He always asked permission before entering the garden now, although Emily secretly suspected he would have been welcome even if he had forgotten. The wolf, however, continued behaving as though permission was entirely optional. Your friend has terrible manners, Emily remarked one bright Saturday morning after discovering the enormous animal peacefully sleeping beside her lavender once again. Ethan glanced toward the wolf with an expression that looked suspiciously like restrained amusement. He can be persistent. Persistent, Emily laughed. He has claimed my favorite spot in the whole yard. Ethan folded his arms thoughtfully. Perhaps he believes it is the safest place. Why would he think that? Ethan looked across the flowers instead of answering immediately. Animals notice things people overlook. Before Emily could press him further, the wolf stood and slowly wandered toward the center of the garden. Instead of roaming freely, he stopped at the exact same circle of grass where he always rested. Curious now, Emily watched more carefully than ever before. He never crossed beyond an invisible boundary surrounding that small section. No matter where squirrels ran or birds landed, he remained inside the same quiet circle as though respecting a line only he could see. That afternoon, Emily decided to test her growing suspicion. She carried a bright red blanket across the yard and spread it several feet beyond the place where the wolf usually rested. If you insist on visiting every day, she said, at least try somewhere more comfortable. The wolf watched her with patient silver eyes. Then, instead of lying on the blanket, he carefully nudged one corner back toward the invisible circle before settling exactly where he always had. Emily blinked. You are the most stubborn creature I have ever met. Ethan smiled softly. Or perhaps the most disciplined. The answer only deepened the mystery. Later that evening, Emily visited Mrs. Henderson, hoping the older woman might finally offer something more useful than riddles. The elderly shopkeeper listened quietly before leading Emily to an old county map hanging behind the counter. Its faded paper showed farms, forests, and streams stretching back more than a century. Mrs. Henderson pointed toward Emily's property. "Long before your cottage stood there," she said gently. "That land was known as Moon Garden." Emily frowned. "I have never heard that name. Most people have not. Time has a way of covering old stories. But some promises outlive memory." Emily traced the faded outline with her fingertip. The marked circle on the map rested exactly where the white wolf always chose to lie. As she walked home beneath the golden evening sky, the pieces refused to fit together, yet they seemed determined to belong to the same puzzle. When her cottage finally came into view, she stopped in surprise. Ethan stood quietly beside the apple tree, looking toward the sunset, while the white wolf rested only a few feet away inside the familiar circle. For one impossible heartbeat, both of them lifted their heads at exactly the same moment, turned toward her with the same calm silver gaze, and smiled with the same quiet warmth, making Emily wonder if she had been asking the wrong question all along. The weather changed without warning 3 days later. Heavy gray clouds rolled across the valley before noon, carrying the kind of cool wind that always arrived just before a spring storm. Emily hurried through the garden, tying climbing roses to their wooden supports and moving clay pots beneath the porch roof. She glanced toward the familiar circle of grass almost by instinct. The white wolf was already there, sitting upright instead of resting, his silver eyes fixed on the distant tree line. For the first time since she had met him, he did not seem peaceful. He seemed alert. "What is it?" Emily asked softly. The wolf did not look at her. His ears shifted toward the forest, listening to something too distant for human hearing. Even Maple abandoned her usual nap on the porch and quietly slipped inside the cottage without needing to be called. An uneasy silence settled across the property. The birds stopped singing. Even the breeze seemed to pause among the lavender. A few minutes later, the sound of approaching vehicles drifted up the gravel road. 2 dark pickup trucks slowed to a stop near Emily's front gate. 4 strangers stepped out wearing matching forest green jackets embroidered with the emblem of a silver wolf. They carried maps, measuring poles, and surveying equipment instead of anything threatening, yet their serious expressions immediately changed the peaceful mood of the morning. Emily walked toward the gate before they reached it. "Can I help you?" The oldest man offered a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am. We are conducting a regional land survey. There appears to be an old property marker somewhere on your acreage." Emily frowned. "I have lived here for 5 years. Nobody has ever mentioned another property marker." The man unfolded an aged map covered with faded lines and handwritten notes. "According to county records, this location has historical significance. We simply need to verify a few measurements." Before Emily could answer, one of the younger surveyors noticed the white wolf sitting quietly beneath the apple tree. His face immediately paled. "Sir," he whispered to his supervisor, "look." Every member of the group froze. None of them stepped forward. None of them even looked away from the wolf. Instead, they exchanged uncertain glances, as though recognizing something impossible. Emily looked from the strangers to the wolf in complete confusion. "He has been here almost every day," she said. "He has never caused any trouble." The oldest surveyor slowly lowered his map. "Has he remained inside that circle?" Emily nodded. "Every single day." The man released a slow breath. "Then we should not disturb him. You were just talking about measurements. Some boundaries are older than survey lines." His answer sounded strangely familiar, almost like one of Mrs. Henderson's quiet warnings. Without another word, the group carefully gathered their equipment and returned to their trucks. They drove away without taking a single measurement. Emily watched the vehicles disappear beyond the hill before turning back toward the garden. "Would someone please explain what is happening around here?" she asked with a tired smile. The wolf finally looked at her. His calm silver eyes held the same quiet patience they always had. But now Emily noticed something she had somehow missed before. Around his neck, hidden beneath thick white fur, rested a narrow leather collar unlike anything sold in ordinary stores. Fastened to it was a small silver pendant engraved with the same crest she had seen stitched onto the surveyor's jackets. Before she could step closer to examine it, a familiar voice drifted gently from behind the flowering dogwoods. I was hoping they would leave without troubling you. Emily turned to find Ethan walking slowly into the garden, his eyes resting first on the wolf and then on her. It seems, he said with a thoughtful smile, that keeping old promises has become a little more complicated than either of us expected. Emily looked from Ethan to the silver pendant resting against the white wolf's neck, then back again, waiting for someone to finally replace riddles with answers. Ethan remained quiet for a long moment, as though carefully choosing which truth belonged to today and which still needed time. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of rain across the garden, while dark clouds drifted over the distant hills. You deserve an explanation, he said at last. But I need you to promise something first. Emily folded her arms. That depends on what you are about to tell me. A gentle smile touched his face. Promise you will judge what you see instead of what you have heard. She studied him for several seconds before nodding once. Fair enough. Ethan slowly walked toward the familiar circle beneath the apple tree. The white wolf rose immediately, not with excitement, but with the quiet respect of an old companion greeting someone who had finally arrived home. Emily expected Ethan to kneel beside the animal or reach out to stroke its thick white fur. Instead, he simply rested one hand lightly against the wolf's shoulder. The garden grew strangely still. Even the wind seemed to pause among the blossoms. Soft silver light shimmered across the pendant hidden beneath the wolf's fur, spreading like moonlight reflected on calm water. Emily blinked, convinced the changing sunlight had created an illusion. Then the light slowly faded. The enormous white wolf was gone, standing in exactly the same place, his hand lowering gently to his side, was Ethan. He had not appeared from behind a tree. He had not walked into the garden from another direction. One heartbeat the wolf had been there. The next heartbeat Ethan stood, where the wolf had been. Emily forgot to breathe. Maple stretched lazily beneath the apple tree without showing the slightest surprise, as though she had witnessed the moment countless times before. Ethan looked at Emily with the same calm silver eyes she had first met across the lavender weeks earlier. Now, he said softly, you understand why I could never honestly tell you he was my dog. Emily searched the garden, half expecting the wolf to reappear from somewhere behind the roses. That was you. Ethan nodded once. The wolf is not separate from me. He is part of who I am. Emily sank onto the wooden bench beside the stone path, trying to make sense of everything she had seen. Suddenly, every impossible detail returned at once. The matching silver eyes, the identical expressions, the repaired fence, the human footprints, the untouched flowers. None of it had been coincidence. Who are you? She whispered. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the garden with unmistakable affection, as though greeting a place he had known much longer than Emily herself. My full name is Ethan Blackwood, he finally said. Most people know me by another title. Before he could continue, the quiet afternoon was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching engines. The same green trucks Emily had seen earlier rolled slowly back toward the cottage, but this time several people stepped out the moment they stopped. The instant they saw Ethan standing beneath the apple tree, every one of them lowered their heads respectfully without being asked. No one spoke. No one questioned why they were there. Emily watched the silent greeting in astonishment as the oldest surveyor stepped forward and said only 6 careful words. Your Majesty, the council awaits your decision. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, almost as though he had hoped this moment would never arrive. When he opened them again, he looked first at Emily, then at the garden blooming around them. I am afraid, he said quietly, that the secret this place has protected for generations can no longer remain hidden. Emily had imagined many explanations during the past few weeks. She had considered escaped wildlife, eccentric landowners, elaborate practical jokes, and even the possibility that loneliness had made her imagination far too active. She had never imagined standing in the middle of her own garden while strangers addressed the quiet man she had been sharing morning coffee with as their king. After the surveyors respectfully withdrew to wait beyond the gate, silence settled over the cottage once again. Ethan walked slowly toward the old apple tree, his fingertips brushing its rough bark with unmistakable familiarity. My family has protected this place for generations, he said quietly. Long before there was a farmhouse. Long before there was even a road through this valley. Emily looked around the blooming garden she loved so deeply. You mean Moon Garden? Ethan nodded. That name was nearly forgotten by everyone except those sworn to remember it. He knelt beside the familiar circle of grass and gently brushed aside a layer of moss. Beneath it, a smooth stone emerged, carved with an elegant crescent moon surrounded by delicate vines. Emily stared in surprise. She had worked in this garden for years without ever noticing the marker hidden beneath the earth. There are 12 stones like this, Ethan explained. Your flowers have quietly protected them all without you realizing it. Emily slowly traced the ancient carving with her fingertips. The stone felt unexpectedly warm despite the cool afternoon air. Why would anyone hide something like this? She asked. Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude. Because some places lose their magic the moment people begin trying to own them instead of caring for them. He looked across the roses, the lavender, the herbs, and every tree Emily had patiently nurtured back to life. You never tried to conquer this garden. You simply loved it. That is why it awakened again. Emily looked around with new eyes. Suddenly the healthier blossoms, the sweeter fragrance, the thriving apple tree, and the peaceful wildlife no longer felt like lucky coincidences. The garden changed because Ethan finished her thought with a gentle nod. Because it recognized the heart of its caretaker. Before she could respond, soft footsteps approached from the gravel path. Mrs. Henderson walked through the open gate carrying a small woven basket filled with fresh bread. She did not appear surprised to see Ethan standing there. Instead, she offered him a respectful smile that carried decades of familiarity. Your Majesty, she said warmly. It has been many years. Emily stared at the older woman in disbelief. You knew? Mrs. Henderson laughed softly. Child, I have known since before you bought this cottage. Emily blinked. And you never told me? It was never my story to tell. Mrs. Henderson placed the basket on the porch before turning toward the ancient stone beneath the apple tree. Some promises can only be understood after they have already begun keeping themselves. Ethan looked toward the forest beyond the garden, where distant clouds continued gathering above the hills. His peaceful expression slowly grew thoughtful. The council believes Moon Garden should become protected royal land again, he admitted quietly. Emily's heart sank, meaning I would have to leave. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the flowers surrounding them, then at the small cottage that had become Emily's home. His silver eyes reflected both duty and quiet sorrow. That, he said at last, is exactly what I intend to prevent, even if it means standing against everyone who believes a king should choose power over promises. Emily stood in the middle of the garden long after the evening sky had faded from gold to deep blue. The gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of lavender through the quiet yard, yet everything around her felt different now that she understood the truth hidden beneath every blossom. The place she had called home was more than a cottage with a beautiful garden. It was a promise that had survived generations. Ethan remained beside the ancient apple tree, watching the first stars appear overhead with the calm patience she had come to recognize. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Some moments seemed too important for hurried words. Finally, Emily broke the silence. If your council believes this land belongs to the crown, then they are going to keep coming back. Ethan nodded. They will. And eventually they will expect you to choose between your kingdom and this place. His quiet smile faded slightly. Yes. Emily looked around the garden one slow time, memorizing every flower bed she had planted with her own hands, every climbing rose she had carefully trained along the fence, every stepping stone worn smooth by years of peaceful mornings. When she spoke again, her voice carried surprising steadiness. Then I will make the decision easier for you. Ethan turned toward her immediately. Emily, listen first. She took a slow breath. If leaving this cottage protects your people and keeps this place safe, then I will pack my things. Gardens can be planted somewhere else. A king cannot simply walk away from everyone who depends on him. Ethan watched her in complete silence. She forced herself to continue despite the tightness growing in her chest. I love this home. I love every inch of it. But I could never be the reason an entire kingdom is divided. For the first time since they had met, Ethan crossed the garden without hesitation and gently reached for her hands. His touch was warm despite the cool evening air, steady enough to quiet every anxious thought racing through her mind. You still believe this has always been my decision, he said softly. Emily looked into his silver eyes. Has it not? He slowly shook his head. The council assumes Moon Garden is valuable because ancient power rests beneath it. They are wrong. Emily frowned. Then what have they misunderstood? Ethan glanced toward the old apple tree where the hidden stone rested beneath blooming grass. Power has never been what protected this place. His gaze returned to hers with unmistakable warmth. People did. He smiled gently. Generations of ordinary people who chose kindness over ownership, care over control. They believed the garden should never belong to a king, not even to me. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. Then why did your wolf keep coming here every day? Ethan laughed quietly, almost embarrassed by the answer. Because wolves understand home much sooner than people do. Before she could ask what he meant, he carefully brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face with a kindness so natural it carried no uncertainty. My wolf never believed this garden belonged to him, he whispered. He believed the person caring for it should never have to stand here alone. At that exact moment, the distant headlights of several vehicles appeared once again beyond the hills, slowly winding toward the cottage. Ethan looked toward the approaching convoy before returning his attention to Emily. The council has arrived, he said quietly. Tonight they expect me to announce who will keep Moon Garden. His hand remained gently around hers. They have no idea that the garden has already made its choice. The convoy stopped quietly outside the cottage just as the last light faded from the western sky. Men and women dressed in dark ceremonial coats stepped through the open gate with measured dignity, forming two respectful lines along the stone path instead of entering the flower beds. Even now, no one disturbed a single blossom. Emily noticed that before anyone spoke, every visitor lowered their head toward the ancient apple tree, as though honoring something far older than the kingdom itself. Ethan released her hands only long enough to step forward. The silver-eyed king carried no crown, no scepter, and no symbol of authority beyond the quiet confidence with which everyone watched him. The eldest council member unfolded an aged parchment and spoke with practiced formality. Your Majesty, according to the ancient charter, Moon Garden shall once again fall under direct royal guardianship. We await your decree. Silence settled over the gathering. Emily felt every heartbeat echo through the peaceful garden. She had already accepted that she might leave this place before sunrise if it meant preserving everything Ethan had sworn to protect. She took one small step forward. If my leaving makes this easier, I understand. Ethan immediately turned toward her. There was kindness in his expression, but also certainty she had never seen before. Emily, he said gently, you have spent weeks believing my wolf was trying to claim your garden. A soft smile touched his face. He was not. He looked toward the ancient stone beneath the apple tree before addressing the council. Read the final line of the charter. The elderly council member hesitated before lowering his eyes to the faded parchment once more. His voice softened as he reached the oldest passage. The keeper of Moon Garden shall never be chosen by blood, title, or power. The garden shall belong only to the one who protects life within it with patience, humility, and love. The council members exchanged surprised glances. Ethan continued quietly. For generations we remembered the existence of the charter, but we forgot its heart. He turned toward Emily once more. My wolf recognized at the moment he crossed the old boundary. The flowers were healthy because she cared for them. The animals trusted this place because she welcomed them. Even the forgotten stones awakened because she asked for nothing except the chance to help things grow. Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly from the edge of the gathering. The garden made its choice long before any of us arrived. Ethan slowly reached beneath his jacket and removed the small silver pendant Emily had first noticed around the wolf's neck. Instead of wearing it himself, he gently placed it in her hands. This has never been a mark of ownership, he said. It is a promise that whoever carries it serves the garden instead of possessing it. Emily looked down at the silver pendant resting against her palms, unable to find words. Around them, the evening breeze stirred the lavender until the entire garden shimmered with gentle movement. One by one, members of the council bowed their heads, not to their king, but to the woman standing beside him. The oldest among them smiled warmly. Then the charter has spoken. Months later, visitors traveling through the valley often stopped beside the little cottage to admire the remarkable garden that seemed to bloom in every season. They sometimes caught sight of a magnificent white wolf sleeping peacefully beneath the apple tree, while an orange tabby cat rested against his side. Nearby, Emily tended the flowers with dirt on her gloves and sunlight in her smile, while Ethan repaired fences, carried watering cans, and laughed whenever anyone joked that the wolf still behaved as though the garden belonged to him. Emily would simply smile, glance toward the contented white wolf, and answer with quiet affection. He never wanted to own this place. He was only trying to find his way home, and somehow, without realizing it, so was I.